Hi, I'm Mark Ashworth.
I'm Neil Harding.
Welcome to Property Insight. Today we're going to be talking about leasehold flats or leasehold properties and what the sort of challenges are with them and what you should be looking out for. So let's kick off with the first point.
Yeah, so service charges. So unlike a freehold property, with a leasehold, you are most likely to have a service charge that's payable annually or possibly monthly. And that goes to the estate management company to maintain the communal areas of the property. It's really important that you understand what's included in your service charges and also how much the service charges are. So I can remember years ago agreeing to buy a property based on my understanding of how much the service charge was annually, which was the estate agent telling me that, and they told me that because the vendor told them how much it was. In actual fact, when I got a latest copy of the service charge invoice from the estate agent, it was considerably more, so almost double, which actually was a deal breaker. So I had to pull out of that deal due to that. So there's a problem, so it didn't stack at that point. So it's also important to remember that typically, not always, but typically included in the service charge is the building's insurance. Okay, and as a landlord, you will be paying the service charge of the property. So the tenant won't be paying the service charge, you will be. Okay, it's important to try and get hold of a copy of the service charge invoice and what's included as soon as you possibly can, so that you understand what those costs are. If you can get one from the point as early as possible from the estate agent, from the vendor, then great, I would do that.
So next to talk about with leaseholds is the ground rent. Many lenders specifically have lending criteria about ground rent and how often that can actually be increased by the freeholder. So it's probably, as ever, very important to check the lease in addition to your solicitor. So you sort of ask these questions, or even the estate agent should have a copy of it. And make sure that you read the section on the ground rent to see when it can be increased by the freeholder. Typically it's in line with the retail price index. That's a very common way of doing it. The other thing is maybe every 10 years or 20 years, or increasing a certain amount every period of time. So just important to understand it, and also just to check with the mortgage broker to make sure there aren't going to be any issues with lending around sort of ground rent increases. And we'll come back to ground rent a little bit later when we talk about extending the lease in particular.
So extending the lease, so when you're agreeing when you're negotiating the purchase price of the property, it's really important to understand how many years remaining on the lease term. And a really important number to have in mind is 80 years. Are there more than 80 years to go or not? Sometimes called the marriage value, but 80 years is quite an important, almost cut-off point really. Below 80 years, it's very difficult to get a mortgage, might even be unmortgageable, the property. So it might be a property that's really only available for cash buyers only. But if you are looking to buy with a mortgage, that really is important to keep in mind. Below 80 years, you need to make sure that the lease term, the short lease term, is reflected in the purchase price. If you are a cash buyer, that can actually represent a really good opportunity for you, because you can maybe buy property at a discount where other people might not be able to if they're mortgage dependent. So if you then have that strategy where you are buying short lease, do keep in mind that you have to own the property for typically 2 years or more before you're then able to issue what's called a Section 42 notice to extend the lease under the statutory lease extension process. That will mean that you will get an additional 90 years added onto your lease term. Since the summer of 2022, I think it was June 22 when the law changed on this, what it also means is that not only will you get an additional 90 years, but also the ground rent disappears completely, which is quite a good bonus for any leaseholders out there that you've got a flat where you're thinking about extending a lease. You do, though, of course, have to pay the premium to the freeholder to extend the lease, which is typically thousands of pounds, but you would need to see your solicitor to go through that process to get advice.
Yeah, I think there's a fairly standard way of working that out. There's a standard calculation that they do in order to work out what the value of that lease extension should be. So ultimately, if you make sure you go through you would always go through a solicitor with that, and they'll obviously advise you to pay what the correct amount should be and the fair amount, fair market value for that lease extension. And if anybody tells you that that's not the case, then I would challenge it. When you purchase a leasehold property, sometimes they have what's called a reserve or sink fund. This is where people would pay into a pot so that if there was a significant amount of work required on the property, it could be a new roof, for example, or it could be some work within the grounds of some kind, maybe even to do with car parking. They would typically have a fund from all of the leaseholders that they could use towards that sort of level of works. So if there is a reserve or sinking fund, sometimes it's called, if that's available to cover significant costs, then you just need to find out how much that cost is and how much extra in the service charge that is, and so that cash pot is built up over that period of time. So this can also affect things like, well, more recently, the cladding rectification issues that happened in London, or it could be to do with double glazing windows, or secondary glazing, or as we mentioned, with a new roof. So block management companies typically prepare a budget for next year's expenses. So you should potentially ask for a copy of that if there is such a fund. For smaller blocks and smaller units, and for flats in smaller blocks, tend to find that's less common. But I think it's more for the ones where you've got 10s or 20s or 30s or 40s sort of different units in one block that they would have those sinking and reserve funds. So just another question to ask your agent or your solicitor. We mentioned cladding before and fire safety. So do you want to just mention about that, because it's I think it's a bit more common these days for lenders, particularly to cover off stuff like this?
Yeah, that's right. I can remember a few years ago applying for a mortgage on a leasehold flat where lenders at the time were insisting that there was a fire safety certificate called an EWS1 in place for the whole block, which honestly was completely unnecessary. And a few months into the conveyancing process, the lender in question actually withdrew that requirement based on valuers' comments, thankfully. But it was at a time of Grenfell, of course, and the disaster that happened there, and a lot more focus was then given on combustible cladding on tower blocks. And the rules around an EWS1, which is essentially a fire safety certificate for a block, are that if the block itself is more than 18 metres tall, and I think it's 4 stories as well, and if there's any kind of combustible cladding, then lenders may insist that, or they might insist that there is an EWS1 form in place. Now, there are still several blocks of flats that don't have one, but the thing to keep in mind from just a pure investor perspective on that is that if the block doesn't have an EWS1, it might impact your mortgage availability or remortgage availability if you currently own one. It's not illegal to not have an EWS1. If an EWS1 is put in place, it is the leaseholder that is going to pay for that, not the freeholder. So again, do keep it in mind, because it could end up having significant costs for you.
Excellent stuff. So permission to let from the freeholder. Now that seems like a bit of a strange one, because if you're buying it as an investment, naturally you would think probably that you have the right to let it out. Well, as a natural fact, you need to check those details to make sure that the freeholder and that the lease allows you to let that out to tenants, because it may just be that it's only for owner occupiers. And sometimes when the agents list these properties, they don't always know that information or actually make you aware of it. So that's something that you need to check, and don't just rely on the solicitor to do that for you. Just make sure that is checked by yourself. And you may also receive an invoice yearly if that is the case, This is news to me because I've not experienced this before, but Neil reliably
I have.
informs me that you may get a bill for anything between £50 to £150 for them just to give you permission to let, where they may ask for a copy of the agreement before the AST contract that you have with your tenant, and that you need permission from them.
Yeah.
So just as a sort of
It's money for
fee.
old rope. Money for old rope. It
So
is.
yeah, there you go.
So apportionment of rent is another thing you might want to consider. So typically, service charges and ground rent, they're often paid a year in advance. They sometimes are paid monthly, but also if the year runs 1st of January to 31st December and you're buying something in the middle of the year, you'll discover that the service charge and ground rent for that whole year was paid early in January. Now, the vendor selling the property to you is probably going to expect effectively a partial refund for that part of the year that they're not going to own the property for. So it could be as much as 11 months worth, depending on the timing of the transaction. So that's something to keep in mind, because that could be potentially thousands of pounds that you are effectively reimbursing the owner for. And the way that is settled is through the completion statement with your solicitors doing the conveyancing for you. So don't be too surprised if on the completion statement, when it comes to finding the final amount of money that you need to transfer to your solicitor to complete on the purchase of the property, actually there's an amount on there as a deduction for 1,000 or even more, which you'll effectively have to find before you can complete.
So if this hasn't put you off choosing to buy leasehold properties, and you can manage these issues that come up, then essentially buying leaseholds can be a good investment and bring you a good yield. But there are arguments that people will prefer to buy freehold properties. I've got mostly freehold. I think most of yours are freehold.
Mostly.
And I think that this video was not intended to put anybody off leaseholds. It's just sort of outline what it is that you need to make sure that you're aware of. So as long as you've done your due diligence and the deal stacks, then go for it. It's quite possibly a great deal. That's all we've got time for on this one. So I hope it's been insightful, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thanks.